This is the Vancouver most people recognize. Glass high-rises next to the water, mountains in the background. It's what you see on the tourism ads, postcards, magnets, and mugs. But this Vancouver is just half the picture. Take a brief walk out of the downtown core, and within 20 minutes, you'll see this. Quiet sidewalks, grass monoculture, and yeah, just regular houses. In fact, these houses make up 81% of the residential land in Vancouver. I think there's a problem with this picture, and to understand that, we have to talk about what's not in this picture, the missing middle. In Metro Vancouver, we primarily have two types of housing. The high-rise or the single-family house. This is most noticeable in a place like Brentwood Town Centre in Burnaby, the second and fourth tallest buildings in British Columbia next to single-family houses. To say it sticks out like a sore thumb would be the understatement of the year. This is the Titanic next to rowboats. Here's another example. Marine Drive in South Vancouver. High-rises, single-family houses. Are you getting the picture? When it comes to housing in Metro Vancouver, it's often supersize or Happy Meal, go big or go home. What's missing are the buildings in between those sizes, like townhouses, row houses, co-housing, walk-ups, or the dingbat. No, this kind of dingbat. These buildings have been coined the missing middle. We just don't build them. In 2018, Vancouver saw the construction of 1,400 detached houses, 4,400 apartment units, and just 56 row houses. Now, why should you care? Well, maybe you've heard of a little thing called the
housing crisis.
Housing.
Soaring real estate prices.
Is this a joke for the government?
Yup, we're in a housing crisis, and most of the new housing we build is in huge, complicated, and often controversial developments. They require tons of planning, concrete, architects, and sometimes a leaning tower of condominiums. And few people even want this kind of housing. A survey found that high-rises were the preferred housing option for just 7% of Vancouverites and 0% of people with acrophobia. That's why many people see a lot of promise in the missing middle, a more measured, more sensitive, and ultimately more desirable way to add more housing without resorting to glass condos. How? Like this. This is the Snail in Strathcona, a 3-story walk-up apartment that provides 11 units of housing with a little cafe, grocery, and hair salon on the bottom floor. Quite a nice place. And just down the street is another building, this one with 12 units of housing, and you can barely tell it apart from the other houses. That is the potential behind missing middle housing. These buildings fit a lot more units than your traditional house without creating a huge disturbance. So instead of pushing one incredibly disruptive project at a time, we can spread out a whole lot of new housing more discreetly over a larger area. Now, will townhouses and walk-up apartments single-handedly solve our housing crisis? Probably not. Trust me, it's complicated. But what I do want to get into is why we don't build this kind of housing in the first place. Why is the missing middle missing? Well, it turns out there's a simple answer to that. It's illegal. The Snail was built in 1906, and times have really changed. Today, we have rules. For starters, you can't build right up to the sidewalk. You can't have your building be too tall, and you have to provide parking spaces, which for a building like the Snail would require a concrete parkade. But the real kicker is the zoning bylaw. Check out the zoning map of Vancouver. All the areas in white are areas where you are only allowed to build a single-family house with a secondary suite and laneway house. Nothing else. So that cafe, not okay. And 11 units of housing? Don't even think about it. So why is the missing middle missing? Well, we regulated it out of existence in most areas. So that begs another question to me. Why did we do that? This zoning map goes back to 1927. Vancouver was a rapidly growing city at the time, and it hired this guy, Harlan Bartholomew, to create this zoning map with one key objective.
Prevent the intrusion of apartment houses in single or two-family residential areas.
You see, back then, apartments had some problems. Rapid population growth and the Industrial Revolution had left many cities with overcrowded and deteriorating housing. Apartments were often described as slums, associated with all kinds of fun things like alcohol, clubs, and sex workers, but also not so fun things like fire, disease, and crime. For those who could afford it, the single-family home just outside the city was a refuge. To these residents, apartments were a threat, the precursors of slums. Single-family neighborhoods had to be defended, and the city's weapon of choice was the zoning bylaw. With those zoning bylaws came other rules like setback and height requirements, as well as parking regulations. And with these rules, the city became divided. Downtown areas with industry, businesses, and apartments, and single-family neighborhoods. Now on the surface, these concerns seem pretty reasonable. I mean, who doesn't want to protect public health and safety? But if we left it at that, I think we'd be leaving out a very important and very disturbing part of this story. In 1907, Vancouver's Saturday Sunset published this political cartoon. On one panel is the typical house of a white working man. On the next panel, a warren on Carroll Street infested by 2,000 Chinese. Yeah. Many single-family homeowners weren't just hostile to the apartment, they were hostile to the people living in them. Immigrants, single men and women, and the working poor. When you look at it this way, I think you see zoning in a very different light. Historian Anthony Sutcliffe summarizes it well. Zoning originated not only to promote safer, healthier cities, but also to keep the poor in their place. Now, our attitudes about downtown areas have changed over time. Today, people have running water, fire extinguishers, and smoke detectors. These days, we aren't so worried about fire and disease. Well, at least until recently. At the same time, fewer people are choosing to start nuclear families in the suburbs. More of us are choosing to be closer to the downtown. In fact, many of the old apartments described as slums in the past now make up some of the most desirable neighborhoods in North America. They have good food, cool shops, and hipsters. But our zoning bylaws and our regulations have remained. And any ideas for adding housing density in these single-family neighborhoods get a lot of pushback.
I am very much opposed to the laneway housing.
Who is driving this and why?
It will destroy the character of single-family areas.
This has raised so many issues. We will run out of food. We will run out of water eventually. At some point, somebody has to stand up and say, we can't absorb any more.
Again, it's a messy mix of concerns. Opponents often worry that more housing would affect their privacy, create more noise, traffic, competition for street parking, shadows, and ultimately, ruin the character of their neighborhoods. But like the past, these concerns continue to be entangled with less tolerant views as well. Don't mind me. In 1988, a group of Shaughnessy and Kerrisdale residents petitioned the city of Vancouver to block the construction of monster houses, large houses that were popular with recent immigrants from Hong Kong. You had the same old worries around heritage and character, but it seemed like some residents were less concerned about the houses and more concerned about the people inside them. Just read this letter to City Council. We fear the power that Hong Kong money wields. These people come with no concern for our past. They have no right to devastate the residential areas. Opposition to new housing can be messy, made up of both understandable and disturbing views. It's very difficult to separate them. But ultimately, all these messy concerns have resulted in a very clear pattern of development. We build new housing in the few, select areas where there is little opposition, and we build big, like this, the Expo Lands. In the 1980s, it was a former industrial site, empty and far away from other neighborhoods. Today, it holds over 15,000 people across 50 buildings. You see a similar pattern of development across Metro Vancouver, in neighborhoods like Brentwood Town Centre and Marine Drive. Huge buildings that compensate for a reluctance to add new housing anywhere else. Former Councillor Gordon Price describes this as the grand bargain, a politically convenient deal that city councils have struck with homeowners. City Hall won't rezone a blade of grass in your single-family zones, but we will pile the density up in high-rises. The answer to the missing middle mystery lies in this political dynamic. When you protect single-family houses against a growing downtown for almost a century, you end up with lots of towers, lots of houses, and very little in between. For much of our history, that has worked out pretty well. Vancouver's glass condominiums are world-renowned, and we have books written about our urban planning. But today, that's creating some new problems. We are running out of non-controversial areas to build more housing in. There are very few sites like the Expo Lands left, Today, our mega developments are increasingly piled onto SkyTrain stations and shopping malls like Brentwood Town Center, but they're also going into areas with more vulnerable residents. They demolish old buildings in Chinatown, cheap rental apartments in Burnaby. In these neighborhoods, new development doesn't just change character, it evicts people. And ultimately, our zoning bylaws and regulations have resulted in a city that is socially and physically divided. We've been able to protect the single-family house, sure, but only the wealthiest of the wealthy can afford it. But I hate to be a bummer, so I'm not going to end the video there. At the heart of this issue is really just a set of rules, and rules can change. Cities like Minneapolis and Portland have eliminated the single-family zone entirely. Here in Vancouver, new policies like the Vancouver Plan might help us begin to reconsider zoning across the city. And these rules don't even have to change all that much. In 2018, Urbanarium hosted a competition inviting architects to design missing middle housing for neighborhoods in Metro Vancouver. What they found was that with just some small changes to our zoning bylaws, setback restrictions, and parking minimums, you could introduce a whole new variety of housing into our single-family neighborhoods. For example, the first place winner, Micro-op. By reducing the setback requirements, it fit 7 units of housing into a 3.5-story building. Or the second place winner, People's Playbook, reducing setback requirements and reducing the parking minimum by half allowed for up to 12 units across 2 properties. And these ideas aren't just about fitting as many people into a space as possible. Pretty much every design incorporated more communal ways of living together, where people form tight-knit communities to share space and resources. Now, you may have mixed opinions about these designs and ideas, but what's undeniable to me is that our politics around development have resulted in a divided and exclusive pattern of housing. So I think it's important that we ask ourselves, are we okay with that? Or do we feel like something's missing here?